collaborators on the project. But I've also done some other work and continue to do work at the moment, doing work on disinformation in elections in Africa, for instance. So it is a topic that is growing quite fast around the world. And I think it's important that we as scholars of Africa take note of that. So let me start by maybe referring you to a report that happened, that was published just last week, 2 weeks ago. It's a report there by the New York Times. The New York Times carried this report about one of the biggest killers in Africa, the mosquito. Just last year, malaria killed 600,000 people in Africa, which is 95% of malaria deaths worldwide. The New York Times article told the story of scientists in Burkina Faso working to release genetically modified mosquitoes that will be unable to spread malaria. A rumor has, however, started to spread on social media that since the release of these mosquitoes, cases of malaria and dengue fever have been on the increase. The posts falsely claim that the mosquitoes are infecting people rather than protecting them. And the reason for that? The non-profit organization working to eradicate malaria is backed by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and other Western institutions. And this rumor was spread by an influencer connected to, or a pro-Russian influencer connected to larger Russian operations to target US-funded healthcare operations in Africa. So this is just one example of how African audiences are targeted by disinformation campaigns. I'll mention some others later and also take a more broader view of the global South. Because this is, of course, not merely an African problem. It is something that is of great concern worldwide. And it's been called a growing global information disorder. And so with information disorder is understood the large-scale contamination of the public sphere with false information, online hate, dangerous conspiracy theories, harmful misunderstandings, and orchestrated campaigns of deception. This disorder is often seen as resulting from recent changes in the media landscape, firstly. So a new digital media ecology, which brought about a crisis for established news media, and which has also made digital curation, digital production ubiquitous. Even in Africa, where there are often huge access problems to the mainstream media and huge inequalities, the mobile phone, for instance, has penetrated widely and has made it very possible and easy for people to share, consume, and even produce disinformation. Another component, another reason for this spread worldwide is that we are in a fractious political environment, heightened polarization. I don't have to explain this to you who will be witnessing an election next week. A rise in populism and ethno-nationalism globally. The problem also has roots in much older social and cultural histories, political economies and power relations, which become especially evident when we view this from the perspective of the global South. And I think this is important, or this is why it is important for us as scholars of Africa and the global South to also contribute to this ongoing conversation around disinformation and information disorder. Because this problem, if you understand it socially, socio-technically, not merely as a technical problem, it has much deeper roots. So aspects related to information disorders such as disinformation, fake news, the risks and threats of artificial intelligence and online hate have become key concerns in scholarship, communication practice, and political discourse in recent years. However, the strong growth in scholarly production on the topic has been dominated by perspectives from the global North. And in this sense, it's not unusual. The study of information disorder replicates the asymmetrical knowledge production of the field as a whole. Scholarship remains, even scholarship about Africa and scholarship about the global South often still is dominated by Northern voices. And this is unfortunate not only from the perspective of epistemic justice or equity in knowledge production, but also because it creates an incomplete picture of the problem as it exists globally. The history, social dynamics, and power relations attendant upon disinformation and information disorder more broadly, with which we include hate speech, etc., are very pronounced in the global South. And understanding these factors within their contexts and within their histories and their social and political factors can also provide insights into drivers of disinformation elsewhere. So it's important for us to understand the problem in the Global South and in Africa, because not only for its own sake, but also because it can enlighten and broaden understanding of the problem elsewhere. So I think I'd like to argue for the importance of the Global South as a context for disinformation studies, with a focus on Africa then tonight. And when I discuss these cases, I think it's important to understand them from a socio-technical perspective. In other words, not merely as a problem of technology, not only as a problem of media or of digitality, but a problem that is also related to social, political, and economic factors. So as I've already alluded to, this project draws on research that I'm currently doing on this IDRC project, but also draws on research that I've been doing with other colleagues. For instance, my colleague Danny Madrid-Morales and others. You'll see on this maps, we have done focus groups in several African countries. We have done online surveys, online experiments, and we have also done interviews and field research. So in our approach to the problem, we also try and follow a mixed methods approach, which, and I'm mentioning this because I think it is, again, important to understand that the problem cannot only be understood in one dimension, in one methodological dimension either, that it is a multifaceted problem and we need various sort of approaches to understand it. I'm also mentioning this to acknowledge my collaborators from whose work I'm drawing here tonight. Danny Madrid-Morales and I have edited that book, Disinformation in the Global South, and that report that has already been referred to. And I'm happy to share links and information about that. So I would like to offer firstly, a critique of some of the concepts. And I acknowledge that maybe as Africanists, this is maybe not an issue that is first and foremost on your minds, but from a media studies perspective, communication studies perspective, certainly, I think there's need for us for quite a bit of more clarification. So before we look at specific cases and examples from the Global South context, I think it's important that we just anchor this in a theoretical and conceptual framework. So although there's been a strong growth in the study of disinformation in recent years, it is still evolving. And we can see this, the fact that it is evolving in the lack of consensus on definitions and epistemology. And without going into too much detail, maybe just a few of these concepts. The first notion of information disorder, which I use here also as an overarching sort of umbrella, is usually, it's attributed to Wardle and Derakhshan, it's their term, and usually seen as consisting of three components, namely misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. And it defines misinformation as false information that is shared, but no harm is meant. Disinformation as false information that is knowingly shared with the intent to cause harm, and malinformation as information which is genuine, but shared to cause harm, often by moving information designed to stay private into the public sphere. So this is a very dominant, very influential typology. At the moment, it does go some way to distinguish between different types of harmful information, but it hinges on the ability to establish intent as the defining characteristic. And that intent is not always possible to establish. So I produce something like that blogger about Russian disinformation around mosquitoes, for instance, at Burkina Faso. I intend to harm. That then, according to this definition, would be disinformation. But if one of you receive it, think it's true, and share it without the intention to do harm, then it becomes misinformation. And so I think there's a problem there, just because we can't always establish intent, and I don't think that is that important. Secondly, the term fake news is widely used in popular and journalistic discourse, but there's now already fairly broad agreement that that term should be avoided. Firstly, because it's imprecise, as it can refer to forms of satire that are intended as critique of journalism, and it's not really news, but takes that form. If we think of things like The Onion, The Daily Show, these, and in the African context, the XYZ show, for instance, in Kenya. These are satirical news programs, which often, or in the past, has been referred to as fake news. but mostly we prefer not to use it because it's been weaponized. It's been weaponized by politicians such as Donald Trump initially, and also then now by politicians around the continent, around Africa and elsewhere in the global south, often using that term as a smokescreen for clamping down on freedom of expression, clamping down on media freedom, and using it as a smokescreen also often to enact laws that do the same. Another critique of the emerging field is that it seems to assume novelty, that it presents itself as an entirely new problem, as if disinformation is something that has emerged recently. And although some aspects of it, such as the speed and the reach of information on social media or the use of advanced technologies such as AI are undisputably new, there's also often a slippage between the notion of disinformation and older concepts such as soft power and propaganda. And these concepts have a much longer theoretical conceptual history, which is often neglected in overly broad uses of disinformation in recent literature. Another critique has to do with the simplistic binaries that are often set up between falsehoods and facts, or information disorder and information integrity. And that tends to present mainstream news and journalism often as the panacea to the problem of information disorder, and often hinges on a sort of very positivistic way of looking at communication. So these binaries also underplay the ways in which journalism and the news media are themselves embedded in political economies, and how what counts as journalistic truth is produced within networks of power. A lot of this discourse around disinformation, if you listen to it, it's as if Michel Foucault and Edward Said and Chomsky never happened, the critiques of mainstream media. It has also been criticized for exaggerating the scope and impact of the problem, that disinformation studies serve as an alibi for a constellation of politicians, researchers, and big tech. Joseph Bernstein called it big disinfo, to decide what information to allow in the public sphere. That it becomes also another sort of form of weaponization, not only by politicians, but also by commerce, by big business, and also by tech as an alibi, sometimes big tech as an alibi to avoid regulation. And so in general, and I don't want to spend much further time on the conceptual critique, but I think safe to say that there is a need for more theory building in this field, and certainly more granular comparative and social technical research that is also embedded in non-Western, non-Northern contexts, to understand this problem as a multi-layered problem that is contextually determined and influenced. So apart from the conceptual critique, I think it is also important to look at the context, the contextual critique of the field. I've already alluded to this, that the field of disinformation studies is still overwhelmingly focused on the global north. The sharp rise in both popular interest and scholarly production can clearly be tracked back to the 2016 presidential election in the US. Which was characterized by the weaponization of the term fake news, but also when concerns about foreign influence operations and the spread of conspiracy theories in mainstream politics became a dominant theme of that election. And so we can also see how some of that now has, I think, re-emerged. When we, and I'm saying this, that the genesis of the field is based in the global north, based on some of the study that we have done. I can show you very briefly. This is from that book that we've done. Very clear spike in the total articles. If we search for mentions of fake news, disinformation, misinformation, you can see the spike there on the top left-hand corner around 2016. At the bottom left quadrant, you can see also how the Americas and Asia, Europe, Oceania, much more attention in the scholarly production than Africa. It is also dominated by communication, and we can see that there is not yet that much also comparative work. It's non-comparative, very often single study. So there's clearly a need, firstly, for more scholarship from the South, and from Africa in particular, and also a clear need for more comparative work. Now that we've established that the dominance of the global north on scholarly production around information disorder, I'd like to argue a bit of why I think it is important to study disinformation from the perspective of the global south. In other words, not merely an argument for epistemic justice or charity, but why it is important for scholars who try to understand what disinformation is and how it works and how it operates, why a perspective from the global south can be beneficial. And this is because the global south provides us with the context in which the historical, political, economic, and social drivers of disinformation are very pronounced. Understanding these contextual drivers can hold lessons for how disinformation operates, how it embeds itself in, for instance, social inequalities, and how that can then be countered, what the best practices are also elsewhere. Countries in the global south have a shared experience of colonialism, marginalization in the global system, and authoritarianism. And this means that they've also have a long historical experience of propaganda, manipulated news, and state control over the media, which enable these political systems. So even when disinformation manifests in contemporary times, it's often rooted in much older networks of power, social and cultural dynamics. So when this mosquito disinformation, for instance, surfaced, that disinformation is rooted in a very deep and very long historical distrust of the West, and particularly of Western science and of Western medicine. And so you can try and counter that by telling people, this is wrong, it's false, the mosquitoes do not spread this malaria. But if it is so deeply rooted in an historical mistrust and attitudes, you'd have to start at a much earlier, a much deeper level than just trying to debunk specific parts of information. So what happens in these contexts, I think, are often instructive of how historical legacies still resonate in contemporary disinformation. And we can look at the way that Russian disinformation operated around Africa exactly in the same way, rooted in my own country, for instance, in South Africa, in a long historical support by Russia for the liberation movements in South Africa and elsewhere on the continent. And so that accounts for the loyalty. And that is, of course, then also, again, appropriated and weaponized, which has been called memory diplomacy by Russia. So we have to understand this in a much longer historical context. So the global south is also characterized by big socioeconomic inequalities, ethnic tensions, racism, gender disparities, and all these factors provide a foothold for disinformation and foreign influence to take hold. Another example from my country, which you might be familiar with, in the bottom right-hand corner, there's just a front page around Bell Pottinger, the now defunct British PR company who, with the help of former President Jacob Zuma's allies, the Guptas, embarked on a online campaign with the hashtag White Monopoly Capital, which weaponized the actual factual huge socioeconomic inequalities in South Africa, which correspond with race in post-apartheid South Africa. But it was used cynically to deflect corruption allegations away from former President Zuma. And unfortunately, it has now closed to a large extent that debate, because that debate is now tainted. To have a debate now about white monopoly capital and inequalities of capital, you have to be very careful not to be dismissed as in the light of that campaign. So another aspect of inequalities, socioeconomic inequalities in Africa and the global south, very stark. But that's not the only place, as we know, where socioeconomic inequalities exist globally. But if we use these examples, they might provide some evidence, provide some best practices also for how to resist it, and can hold lessons for the global north. Excuse me. Another aspect of why it's important to look at the global south is that the history of authoritarian and state control of information and the media has bred distrust in official narratives. Again, this goes back to colonial and post-colonial eras where the media were often state-owned and controlled. Many African countries, the state still wields influence and ownership over media. And so alternative networks of communication have often become more trusted. This includes gossip, so-called pavement radio, radio trottoir, in Stephen Ellis's well-known formulation, satire, jokes, the word on the street. And so historically, these networks have served a progressive function. They've often provided more trusted and alternative forms of information outside the colonial powers, but they have become entrenched in a way that humor and satire can also now provide a foothold for disinformation. So attention to context in the Global South may hold lessons for the North. Guy Berger reminds us that Ukraine, for instance, was a target of geopolitical interference before this became a concern in the 2016 elections in the US. Disinformation was weaponized in the Philippines towards journalists like the Nobel laureate Maria Ressa before accusations of fake news led to similar hostilities towards journalists in the US. We have learned from Facebook whistleblowers how that social media platform was complicit in hate speech against the Myanmar military, by the Myanmar military against the Rohingya, before similar tactics were used in domestic US politics. And the ethnic and racial polarization, which I've mentioned, fomented by the Bell Pottinger campaign, is in its essence not that different from the identity politics that also underpins political polarization elsewhere. So a focus on the Global South and Africa in the context of our conversation here today can help us understand how disinformation is embedded in a range of social, political, economic, and historical conditions and experiences, and also older concerns about communication. Yet for such comparisons to be made, disinformation first has to be understood within the specific context in order to identify the drivers, histories, and power relations that underpin it. Once these specific contextual textures are discerned, extrapolation and comparison can start, and not the other way around. And if we understand these drivers better, they can also help us to design more contextually appropriate responses, countermeasures, rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. And this is also important when we think about regulation, for instance. Regulation against disinformation, very strong and already quite evolved in, for instance, the European context, but to transpose that regulation willy-nilly to the African context could, for instance, empower authoritarian governments to use that as a smokescreen to clamp down on freedom of expression. So we'd have to find another way of approaching it. So now that we've considered the conceptual and the contextual critiques of the field of disinformation studies, it might be useful to look at the context of the Global South itself then. So how big a problem is disinformation in the Global South and in Africa specifically? On the top left-hand corner, you can see there a study that Madrid Morales and myself did in 2019, where we asked people, how often do you think you come across stories about politics and government that are completely made up? And that is a replication of a study that was done in the US, in fact, a Pew study that we just replicated the methodology. And so what we found there is that the survey have shown high perceived exposure to disinformation in South Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, in those three countries, Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria. And they correspond also with a low trust in the media. And the perceived exposure to disinformation in these African countries were even higher than in the US, where it dominates the headlines and scholarly research. Research from the Reuters Institute, the Digital News Report, this is already the 2021 report, but recent subsequent reports have reiterated that there's growing concern among news audiences globally about disinformation, and that undermines also their trust in the media and breeds cynicism, which is a problem because it makes it hard then to counter the problem with authoritative, legitimate information if people are cynical about all information they receive. Another way of measuring the extent of the problem is by looking at the reaction it is eliciting from governments. And there's been a steep increase in punitive fake news laws issued by governments in the South and certainly also in Africa. In Africa alone, the number of such fake news laws have doubled in the space of 5 years, from 2016 to 2021. So again, 2016, weaponizing the term fake news, that weaponization adopted and appropriated by African governments, and they double their fake news laws. So when we approach this problem contextually, I think it is important for us to look at a specific set of contexts, which I will try to highlight briefly in the remainder of my talk. I think it is important for us to not necessarily, well, certainly not to avoid homogenization, that understand that there are different experiences in the Global South as well. But that these differences might appear along linguistic, gender, income level, or ethnicity, the dissimilarities and the similarities rather than national borders. So although much of this work is still organized with the nation state as the unit of analysis, I think increasingly we'll have to look at transnational spaces, because that is also how disinformation spreads, how these technologies operate, and also how the similarities between, for instance, gender inequality, income inequality, use that as a point of focus rather than intranationally. So I'd like to focus on these four contexts: the media context, socioeconomic context, political context, and the geopolitical context. And I just want to give you some examples of some of the research that we've done to illustrate why those specific contexts are important to understand the problem. So firstly, the media context. Across the Global South, the media is characterized by high levels of concentration. It means that they are often state-owned or state-controlled, or they are controlled by powerful corporations which hold a large sway over the media landscape. In other words, there's little diversity. We've seen diversity grow certainly on informal level, on so-called peripheral actors of journalism, bloggers, social media commentators, influencers, etc. But the mainstream media still highly concentrated. The mainstream news media, historically also in Africa and the Global South, has been linked to much older networks. If you want to use the term echo chambers, which people often use now to describe the insular communities online, those sort of echo chambers also existed in the news media, and for a much longer time, because they were linked to older networks of class, language, race, and ethnicity, which again, going back to the colonial times, were used as a sort of divide and rule tactic. So for these historical reasons, news media in the Global South often experience a lack of trust among their audiences. Or they present perspectives, because they are so concentrated and elite controlled, that they present perspectives that do not resonate with large parts of society. So those parts of society, if the poor, the marginalized, they are then drawn to alternative sources of information. And so the lack of trust in news media can again be seen in that survey results. Again, this is sort of already quite a few years old, but just an example that where we've seen that there's a low decreasing levels of trust in local media, which is then related to perceived exposure to disinformation. So in other words, people perceive to be that there's a lot of disinformation out there that they come across, then they also start distrusting the mainstream media. Although the mainstream media would like to claim that they are presenting a counter alternative, in fact, there's a broader cynicism growing. And we found this in subsequent work also among young people. We've done focus groups very recently with young people around South Africa to look at media literacy and disinformation literacy. Again, what we hear is people just become cynical and they become disempowered. They don't know what to believe anymore. We see attacks on journalists, trolling, doxing, online hate, gender-based violence also increasing. And again, these online tools are used to undermine trust in the mainstream media in that way. So on the one hand, in other words, you see a very precarious news media, historically polarized, lack of trust, etc. On the other hand, if we look at new media, digital media, social media, we see that there's a huge expansion in these emerging markets, that big global platforms such as Facebook and Twitter or X, TikTok, are seeing Africa and other parts of the Global South as emerging markets where they aggressively penetrate. And so these big global platforms such as Facebook and Twitter act as gatekeepers of information on the one hand. They have also had these deals that they sell to audiences that you say you you can have Facebook for free, and then we only curate the number of, it's Facebook Zero, you only curate a number of websites for you. So they're gatekeepers, but at the same time, they also act as amplifiers of disinformation. And Facebook's own fact-checking is usually skewed towards the global north. Figures a few years ago, 9% of Facebook users speak English, but 87% of money spent by Facebook at combating disinformation is directed at English language content. So very underserved. Local languages are very much underserved. And so not only is there a lack of moderation in languages other than English, but moderators that lack knowledge of cultural context may not recognize the disinformation and hate speech when that is spread by means of innuendo. Innuendo that refers to histories, jokes, humor, satire, etc., that are rooted in local context, and that we've seen in recent TikTok, the use of TikTok in Kenyan elections to spread disinformation. So Facebook's collaboration with fact checkers in the global south has also been criticized for being very slow and inconsistent. And with that, the messaging services like WhatsApp are usually important, growing very fast, not only within Africa and the global south, but also within its diaspora. And so that, again, has this sort of double role of, on the one hand, offering refuge from surveillance. If the mainstream media are state-controlled, or if there are other ways of surveillance, WhatsApp is seen as a place where people are safe from that because it's encrypted. But at the same time, then those channels become platforms where hate speech and disinformation can spread very quickly because it's difficult to penetrate and difficult to monitor. AI, generative AI is still a new phenomenon. There's a lot of concern about that. I personally think it's overstated in the context of Africa. I think we have much simpler and easier problems. Well, maybe not easier, I shouldn't say easy, but easy to recognize, like WhatsApp and messaging platforms. But there are examples already of deepfakes of Cyril Ramaphosa, Akanye Ishilema. There's a picture of him, Zambian president, saying that he would retire from politics. At this point, it's quite easy to recognize that as a deepfake. But watch the space. In the years to come, it will become more sophisticated. And I've already mentioned some regulatory challenges, but it is important that when we speak about regulation in Africa, that we don't just import it from elsewhere, because it can create even more problems in terms of repressing freedom of speech. So we'll have to think about a multi-stakeholder involvement in regulation. So onto the second type of context, I think that is important, and that is the social cultural context. If we want to understand disinformation, information disorder, we have to understand within a social cultural context. And this is illustrated by some of the research that we've done, again, in Kenya and South Africa, where we've asked people, firstly, if they recognize this information, and then if they receive it, would they share it? And if they share it, why? And it was alarmingly the numbers of people that said, even if I suspect this to be false, even if I think this might not be true, I will share it. And when we ask them why, they say, I have a duty to warn others. That's the first response. You can see there very high figures. I have the duty to warn others. So there's very much a sort of communitarian, almost a convivial approach to this, to say, well, even if I distrust it, I have a duty. And then there are other things like to generate discussion is another motivation. Again, I think referring to this conviviality and often the existence of very strong oral communication networks in Africa. Another aspect that is in the social cultural context, in the African context, that is important is the role of religion and family ties. Often the religious leaders would be trusted much more than the mainstream news media or family members, the elders. And culturally, in many of these countries, it's very difficult to correct an elder or elder member of family or some authoritative figure, a religious leader, if they spread disinformation, to correct that, because corrective practices are actually quite important. But it's difficult to do that within these cultural and social contexts. The next context, I think, is important to look at is the political one. To understand that within the global south, across the global south, when we consider the political dynamics, historically, we see that the region is frequently marked by upheaval, protest, conflict, and that impacts on media and communication. And increasingly frequently, we see these elections, political processes being disrupted by disinformation. It has happened in Asian countries. The term buzzers have emerged originally from Indonesia, but that as a sort of state-backed or politically party-aligned online actors that spread disinformation or messages on behalf of parties that are often paid to do so, so it's commodified. And that buzzing has spread to almost everywhere. I mean, it's almost everywhere now a feature of political campaigning, that sort of under the radar sort of buzzing. And we've seen that in South Africa in the recent elections as well, where there are paid influencers or influencers that are aligned very strongly to specific parties or politicians. They get paid. They then enlist a smaller set of influencers who in turn then enlist nano influencers with just a few followers. And then you build this big network of influence. And it's then very difficult to establish the provenance of those messages. Also, I think important in all these countries, we've already mentioned that, the rise of ethno-nationalism. We see increase of hate attacks on the basis of ethnicity, religion, or nationality. We've seen that in elections around the continent as well. In Kenya, notably, we've seen this year, last year on the basis of also sexuality, sexual orientation, for instance. And we've seen that in Namibia and elsewhere as well. So often hate attacks on politicians are based on these very deeply entrenched sort of biases. Governments themselves often sources of disinformation. We know that that's the case everywhere, but it's much harder to resist that when you are in an authoritarian context where there isn't freedom of speech. If you were to resist these governmental disinformation, that it will land you in jail or worse. Also important just go back there. Also important here is the historical legacies that play a role. We've seen, and I've mentioned already the Burkina Faso example that I've started the talk with, the anti-Western sentiment. And we've tested this in a number of countries, in Angola, Ethiopia, South Africa, and Zambia, with Chinese and Russian disinformation. And there's a clear correlation between people that are more pre-elected, more prone to believe the Russian or Chinese disinformation if they also see the US as an enemy. So if the respondents saw the US as an enemy or have strong, deeply anti-Western attitudes, which are growing around the continent, we know that from Afrobarometer surveys, for instance, then they are more likely to believe statements like the war in Ukraine is a consequence of NATO's expansion. So geopolitical context, again, deeply rooted in historical legacies. So how do we respond to all of this? And this is how I'd like to just end with a few examples or a few ideas of how to respond to the problem. So once we understand the problem and we understand it socio-technically, not only as bits of information that we can counter with corrections, but that it is rooted in a sort of deep social, cultural, and historical environment, how do we respond? And the best responses, I would argue so far, is those that combine different issues that are intersectional. So in the scoping research that I have done with my colleagues around the Global South for this IDRC project, it is clear that they understand that disinformation is only one dimension of a much broader set of issues that plague the information and communication landscape in their region. And that means that disinformation cannot be tackled in isolation, but should form part of a much broader strategy, which links disinformation with other issues. So examples of this, for instance, if you talk about quality of information, you have to also link that to rights of access to information and digital technologies. So, and that means that you, in other words, make sure that people have access to information so that they can discern and that they can have choice and that they can have access to good quality information. That then in turn requires policy interventions. It requires policy interventions on cybersecurity, surveillance, data protection. And so there are consortiums, for instance, the ALSUR consortium in Latin America, who's done important work in this, but elsewhere in Africa, also similar policy work on that level. Another linkage would be, for instance, to link anti-disinformation or counter-disinformation efforts with struggles for media freedom and the right to protest. So that if people, you cannot just root out disinformation or hate speech if you do not allow people to also exercise the right to protest, for instance, or to express themselves online. So that again then means that if you want to combat hate speech, you first have to combat the restrictions on media and freedom and expression. Another combination, which we've also seen in recent years, and there's certainly this so-called year of elections, we've seen that in Africa and certainly in South Africa, where activists link electoral disinformation with internet rights. So advocacy campaigns engaging politicians and digital platforms to give better access, to give access to data as well, to explain how the algorithms work in order for that counter-disinformation efforts to really be effective. We know that the technology platforms often say they would do that. They often say they want to collaborate, but they don't always do that. Another way of attacking the problem in an intersectional way would be to combine fact-checking with media literacy initiatives. So there's been a lot of faith, strong growth in media and in fact-checking, although there's now skepticism is starting to set in about its effectivity, but to link that with media literacy. So not only to check facts, but also to help people to understand how those facts are produced, and how to discern them themselves. And lastly, fact-checking with investigative journalism, media ethics, and journalism training. So in other words, what is needed, and also when we talk about a research agenda to go forward, is that what is needed to counter disinformation is firstly an understanding of what the drivers of the problem are. We cannot just attack the problem, develop countermeasures if we don't have a really deep understanding of the problem. And I think this is where African studies scholars like yourself have a very important contribution to make. If you understand the history, the context, the politics, the local or political economy, then it's a much richer understanding of also how disinformation works in those contexts. So the drivers of the problem have to be understood historically, socioeconomically, politically, and certainly also comparatively. In the first priority, I think, is then to develop more research on information disorder in Africa and the Global South. And this is almost all talks or presentations that we always hear, is to say we need more research from Africa and the Global South. Unfortunately, I think it remains true. In doing so, I think we should avoid replicating models just for the sake of diversity. We have to build theory from the South, not only do comparative studies that have been designed elsewhere and that we just, from an African context, just provide the raw material and the case studies and the data, but that we also design studies based on this local knowledge and that we embed it within a broader understanding. And I think lastly, what is a major challenge also for my own work, which I acknowledge so far has largely been online communities. What is needed is more ethnographic research beyond online communities. Spend time within communities, understand how they are exposed to disinformation, why they trust it, why they spread it, and what the best ways to be to counter it. And also what they're already doing themselves, the agency that Africans themselves have already to counter, to recognize and to counter disinformation. But that, I think, needs more on-the-ground ethnographic research. And I think this, again, is where a scholarly community such as yourselves have a very important contribution to make in this regard. So thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you. I hope it's been useful. I hope it resonates with the work that you're doing, and all the best for the rest of your conference.
Well, thank you very much for a very provocative and interesting presentation. I'm going to invite people now to pose questions or comments. I'm sure there will be several. I know we have several people who are interested in this topic and experts in some way relative to the topic. I think what I'll ask that we do is take maybe 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then give you the opportunity to address all of them as a group. So maybe while we are waiting for some people to gather their thoughts and a question, maybe I'll start it off. And you touched on a lot of these points throughout the presentation, but I'm wondering about a kind of response. Sorry, we have like a timing system here where they blow a steam whistle. It makes noise, so that's what you heard in the background if you heard it. I'd like to ask about a kind of response that in some ways maybe it shares some of this problem that you mentioned of creating a kind of broader distrust in all kind of information, doing the work of kind of just cynicism and promoting distrust in kind of society in general. But I wonder about this idea of saying, to what extent is this a kind of moral panic? To what extent has this been happening all the time? And in fact, as you well noted, much of the disinformation in the form of propaganda has been happening throughout the colonial period and the post-colonial period, often from spaces in the quote unquote West that are now the ones who are crying about the fact that there is this kind of misinformation. And should we, if we're taking, if we're thinking about the problem from various African contexts, should we think about how much maybe there is too much faith in that this illuminates a kind of excess of faith in the veracity or the particular narrative about history and the present that a lot of mainstream cultural institutions in the West sort of take to be true, but are based on their own sets of problematic assumptions about the world and their own occlusions of very important processes. So that's the basic question as to get a response to that, and you touched on that a bit. I saw that Dr. James Yeku, who was with us, had a hand up. James, are you still there, and do you want to pose a question?
Yes, I do have a question. And thank you so much, Professor Wasserman, for a very stimulating lecture. I suspect that there's an assumption in this kind of research to enact some kind of binary between media studies and Africanist studies kind of scholarship. And I think we might have seen a bit of that in your talk. And that makes me wonder to what extent you see that you think that kind of Manichaean way of thinking is relevant to the advancement of the kind of research you're doing. 2019, for example, there was a special issue by the Journal of African Cultural Studies on notions of fakes and fakery, which had several papers on the kind of issues you're raising with us. And I just wonder to what extent your work demonstrates the necessary familiarity with the already happening engagement between both fields. That for me is really important. And of course, sometimes, and this is not limited to this talk, I see an anxiety generally to talk about global north media platforms that are used in the global south, and how, this dichotomy between the global north and the global south sometimes elide much more obvious continuities and flaws. I wonder how you attend to some of these. Again, thank you so much. I appreciate listening and learning from your work.
Yeah, I think those are pretty big questions, so we'll let you respond to those while other people get ready to pose other ones.
Yeah, thank you very much. These are really good questions, and I don't necessarily have good answers to them, but I think they highlight important things for us to keep discussing. I think in terms of the moral panic question, the first one, the question, what is new in this? Is anything new or not? I think one could obviously, there's a risk that one also then tilts over to the other side and say, well, there's nothing new. I think there are certain things that are new. The speed with which this is spread, enabled by digital technologies. Similarly, the ubiquity of this, again, in the African context through mobile phones. And so to some extent, one could say that yes, there certainly are similarities, and we can draw on propaganda studies, for instance, to help us understand the sort of driving factors and the motivations behind it. But the manifestation thereof, I think there are new things happening, which we need to also take into account, certainly just in terms of the digitality and the technicality thereof. But I think the more important, maybe for me, the more interesting question there is around the moral panic is the geopolitical dimension of that. And I think there you are entirely right. And we are, Danny Madrid-Moraes and myself, actually, we are presenting a paper or hoping to present a paper next year at ICA around exactly this, because we're often, approached by researchers or funders or, whatever consultancy firms, where they say, well, especially you say around Russia, we want to see what disinformation Russia is spreading in Africa, what disinformation China is spreading in Africa, assuming that, and then that usually what you see there is an assumption that whatever information China is spreading is disinformation, right? Not necessarily drawing the distinction between some of their media investments, the sort of the work that Xinhua, for instance, is doing, certainly has similarities to what the US has been doing, Voice of America, or what Deutsche Welle has been doing. And there are similarities. And then there's almost that sort of blindness of saying, well, these new players on the block, this new scramble for Africa, they are doing the disinformation. What we have been doing is something else. Of course, I think, again, there's a danger that we homogenize. I think, obviously the US communication system is, at least in name, and so was a European one based in a notion of media linked to democracy, not to a state-owned, state-controlled type of media. There are certainly, I think, more better and less better, worse types of media systems. So again, try not to homogenize it. But I think there is the question around who drives this moral panic. What are the geopolitical motivations behind sponsoring maybe this moral panic? I think is an important one to ask. Are we looking for disinformation when it is not there? Are we labeling things as disinformation, which might not be accurately described as such because it is done from a very specific geopolitical normative framework? And I think that is an important question to ask. The second question around the binaries between media studies and, say, cultural studies and African studies, I absolutely agree that we should avoid them. If that is what your point, that I think we should avoid those binaries. I myself won't claim familiarity with all these other contexts, but I personally come from a sort of literary cultural studies background, so I do have a familiarity, or at least affinity for other approaches. But it is true, I think, that media studies often is very media-centric, that it starts and ends often with media, and understanding media as being at the center of the world. And I think what African studies, cultural studies, historical studies, political studies, all of these other approaches can contribute to the study of disinformation is exactly that longer historical, cultural, social dimension, and help us understand media in a social and a cultural, etc. context. So therefore, I think the need for collaboration and for interdisciplinarity is really important. And from the slides that I shared with the research that we've done show that is not yet happening. There's not yet enough interdisciplinary and comparative work. The field is often driven by sort of a highly technocentrist approach as well. And I think there's definitely scope, and it's also important that people from other fields contribute to that. Lastly, the point about the dichotomy between global south and global north, I take your point completely. Well, we can also even just discuss or debate the term global south, whether that is useful or not. Again, it's been critiqued. We could talk about the majority world. We can talk about other terminology. I think we're trying to signal through that maybe some sort of sense of solidarity around the majority world, maybe also signal a sort of research agenda that is very expressly and explicitly focused on parts of the world that are not, pretty bluntly, in the US and Europe. But I think whenever one gets too wedded to a concept or a term, and becomes too easy to use it, then we should be worried. So I think unpacking that dichotomy certainly is important.
More questions or comments?
There's one from
Peter.
Yeah, Peter.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you, yes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wasserman. Your lecture was very good. I enjoyed it. Yeah. But my problem has to do with the issue of journalistic freedom. So the media itself seems to be involved in misinformation. So how is it possible to regulate the media without the usual cry of violation of freedom of expression, of freedom of journalism, freedom of all those kinds of things? And I also want to know why Africa north of the Sahara is not part of this continental approach to this major issue. Yeah.
Okay, shall I take that? Or
Yeah, please do. Yeah, please do.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Thanks. I think these are, I mean, again, very important questions. Of course, the lack of journalistic freedom in Africa is a major concern. There's been democratic backsliding in recent years, which usually also involves the repression of the media, not only of the media, of the news media, but also freedom of expression. I always try to link the two because otherwise, I think when we elevate journalism to the pedestal and not acknowledge, for instance, the clampdown on activism and protest and so on, then some of the gains that might be made in the journalistic context not necessarily shared more broadly. And we have seen examples of just, for instance, how people's phones are confiscated or harassed just for sharing things on WhatsApp and so on. So I think journalistic freedom should be linked to the broader question of freedom of expression. But I think what is important here in the context where we see this authoritarian backsliding is that we should be very careful around regulation. Because I think freedom of expression is important, but at the same time, regulation is too. So maybe the obvious answer might be that self-regulation of some sort would be high on the priority list. So media ethics, self-regulation of the media through media ethics. But again, that is not a panacea. Media organizations don't always subject themselves to it. Again, here in my own country, in South Africa, we have a major media group, the Independent Media Group, who themselves are very deeply involved in the spreading of disinformation, to confirm your point that the media is part of the problem. I mean, they launder Chinese disinformation, they spread absolutely false stories about the mother who had 10 babies, etc. Yet they withdrew from the press council. They then later, that's the self-regulatory body, they later rejoined, and then they were expelled because they didn't subject themselves to the rulings. So even self-regulation, ethical regulation is not foolproof. And that, I think, is where things like critique and peripheral commentators actually can play an important role. Academics, researchers, activists, but also just members of the public. That then goes hand in hand with the quest for more freedom, of course, and access so that people can do that. But I am a strong advocate for a type of regulation that is multi-stakeholder, but also democratic and open and participatory. And we need what has been referred to as an open ethics, a sort of ethics that's not linked just to professionalism and a sort of small clique of so-called professional journalists who among themselves decide what ethics are and what they should be doing, and then often just give each other a rap over the knuckles when they do that wrong. But to involve different stakeholders, NGOs, members of the public, civil society, etc. as well. And lastly, I think your question around why is Africa north of the Sahara not involved? I agree that too often it isn't. In our studies, some of the work that I've highlighted here, personally, my focus is on sub-Saharan Africa, and even maybe a bit parochial in the sense that I look at Southern Africa. But that is why it's important to, again, to have comparative and collaborative work. The IDRC project that I'm part of does have a strong team in the MENA region. We work with Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism, ARIJ, in Amman, in Jordan. We have met there. We had a conference. We work with them. They provide field work. So it is something that we strive towards. But yeah, I think there is definitely scope for more North Africa and Middle East, that region, to be involved in the scope of this work as well.
Thank you very much. I have to go to class.
Thank you.
Bye. Sure.
Additional comments or questions? We have a few minutes left. So please feel free. Don't feel like you're pushing us past the time. Well, I'll take that as confirmation of the fact that we're still pondering a lot of the things that you've said and taking it in and trying to digest it. So thank you very much again for being willing to join us at a time that must be very busy for you. I know you're leaving tomorrow on a long trip, so thanks for that. And we'll be continuing these discussions of these topics in the rest of the MAAAS conference. So I hope that some of you in the audience will join us for that in person or online. And Herman, I hope that we get a chance to meet sometime in the near future. Thank you very much for.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you very much to everyone for your attention and your participation. I enjoyed the talk. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.